We are reaching the end of the semester, and in this presentation, I want to go over guides to completing your final assessment. And I want you to pay really close attention to these presentations because they are going to tell you every step that you need to take. And they are also going to give you examples of how these steps work in practice. And what I'm going to be doing is showing each one of the steps that you take, what you need to do in each section of the final proposal, and then just giving a demonstration of how those steps can be taken with an example of some published work that I did on celebrity, gender, and reality television. So, the first thing that we need to have a look at is the breakdown of the assignment, and the breakdown is here in front of you: intro, lit review, methods, findings, discussions, and conclusions and reflections. And the immediate thing you'll see is that what you're really being asked to do is provide brief and revised summaries of the work that you've already done, and then put the bulk of your effort into analyzing the data that you've collected, whether that be media content, whether it be interviews, whether it be social media data, and then thinking about what it all means, and importantly, suggesting a path for future research that you might like to do on the basis of your experience doing this project. So the introduction is the introduction, lit review, and methods sections are revisions of things that you've already done. So we're necessarily asking you to be brief and reflective. So what we're asking you to do in each one of these sections is really think critically and think hard about what it is you're really trying to do, how you can take on board some of the advice that you've had, and produce nice, neat summaries of your research question, the literature, the main literature, the main ideas that you're drawing on in formulating and pursuing this research question, and the rationale behind your method. That is, you're not simply talking about the method you used, you're also importantly talking about why you have selected the method that you've selected. And I can tell you straight off the bat that one of the places where people lost a lot of marks in the second assessment was in not doing that, in simply outlining a method without explaining why that method was chosen. And you should never do that. You should always explain your method. So make sure you do that in the final assessment. But then we're also going to be talking about about 2/3 of the paper, which is about your findings and your discussions. And I'm going to be talking in these presentations about how to make sense of the evidence that you gather. So let's jump off with talking about your introduction. So this is going to be 100 words. Now that sounds really, really brief, but there's a really deep practical skill involved in this. When you're writing any type of professional communication, what the reader wants you to do is get to the point. Don't waffle around. Don't talk about, in this media world in which we live today, in which there's a lot of media and all this kind of stuff. People want you to get to the point. So you're being asked to be professional in these in these opening sections. So the introduction. And what your introduction should do is explain the basis of your research. What is your research question and why is it important? Now, the example that I want to talk about is about some research that I did on a well-known global reality TV star called Charlotte Church, who originally hails from the UK, but was for many years, for about a decade, was a leading cast member on the incredibly successful MTV show Geordie Shore. And Charlotte Church has become a very interesting celebrity in Britain and around the world. She's a very successful, I would call her a media entrepreneur. She's translated her success on Geordie Shore into a considerable reality TV career and TV presenter career. And she also has a number of subsidiary outside commercial endorsements and commercial products. So she's a really successful entrepreneurial figure who is one of the few figures who've managed to translate reality TV fame into a sustainable career. So there's a lot to really admire about Charlotte Church, despite the fact that she begins on a show which is one of your typical kind of reality shows, which is basically about young people living together and drinking a lot and partying, and there's really nothing else to it. So a remarkable success story in a lot of ways. She's still very popular. She's still very successful, and she's earned quite a decent amount of money, a sustainable amount of money from her career. And yet the thing that interests me about Charlotte Church is that despite all of the success and despite the fact that she's only just turned 30, she's a very young woman. My impression was is that she is nevertheless portrayed as something of a tragic figure. And so, what Charlotte Crosby allows us to do is to examine how much things have really changed between the mid 20th century into the 21st century around media discourses of women. And one of the things that I know from my research is that in the 20th century, researchers argued, and here we're talking about the Cultural Indicators project. One of the things that the first content analyses of media and gender did was they noticed that media in the mid 20th century really enjoyed telling stories about women who suffered for daring to be different. Women who didn't buckle down to marriage, didn't do what they were supposed to do under patriarchy, were quite often portrayed as coming to a sticky end. And what I wanted to know is, I wonder if we find the same thing in celebrity gossip. And I particularly, because it just kind of occurred to me that a lot of the stories that I was seeing about Charlotte Crosby were about her leading quite an unhappy life. And I thought, well, I wonder if we got a coherent sample of celebrity news about Charlotte Crosby. I wonder if we could see the same stories being told. So, would that mean, for example, would that be important? Because it would indicate that despite the fact that we feel we live in a very different media environment from the sort of media environment that our mothers and grandmothers grew up in, would it be true to say that in some respects we're being exposed to the same sorts of stories, albeit through different media forms and different media content? So this is quite important socially, because I guess the idea underneath all of this is that these sorts of stories that we encounter about gender have an effect on what we think it's possible to be and do as women and men. So the question is, despite the impressions of social change, do young women still live in symbolic environments that aren't that different from those experienced by older generations? So then we move on to the literature review. And here, what we're asking you to do is, obviously, you've already done your literature review, but what we want you to do here is just go back and in a couple of hundred words, get to the point. Reflect on your feedback, think about the ideas that you covered, and come up with the main ideas. What are the main ideas that have influenced the way that you are going to approach your data? So the way that that worked with regard to my research on Charlotte Crosby, I keep saying Charlotte Church because she's another famous British celebrity. Um, but I've said here that from the 1950s, the Cultural Indicators Project consistently found that pop culture women were more likely than men to be victimized, were more likely to pay a personal price for professional success, and were more likely to become objects of ridicule as they aged. And this is significant today because research from the Gina Davis Institute suggests that patterns in gendered storytelling haven't changed that much in the last 50 years. So if we look at the news about celebrity gossip about a global celebrity star, do we find a similar kind of pattern to the sorts of patterns that TV audiences would have encountered in the 1950s and the 1960s and up to the 1970s? So that is and in the research itself, I did a lot of reading on cultivation theory, on representations of gender, on textual analysis, contemporary approaches to textual analysis about gender. And these were the principles that I came up with, leading to these three questions. So you need to be doing something similar in your summary of your literature review. Really, again, get to the point. And finally, methods. How did you conduct your data? How did you collect? How did you conduct your research? How did you collect your data? How did you ensure that you went about your project ethically? Well, what you need to do in this section is you need to first explain your sample. What is your evidence base? If you're doing interviews, who are you talking to? Why are you talking to those specific people? If you're selecting media content, what is the content you're looking at and why? Now, remember, the really important thing is it can't just be a number that you pick out of the air. I'm going to look at 25 news stories about this issue. Why? Why 25? Why not 50? Why not less? Why not more? Why from the sources that you're picking? What do you think that they are representative of? And the second thing you need to do is think about explaining your indicators. So you've gathered a bunch of interviews and your media content or whatever it is. What are you looking for? And I suppose kind of one of the ways to do this is to frame your indicators, the things that you're specifically keeping an eye out for in your evidence, in regard to theory. So one useful trick to be able to do is to relate your indicators, the things that you're looking for, the evidence that you're keeping a particular eye out for in your evidence in your data, to academic concepts and theories. So, for example, what I did in the Charlotte Crosby research is I gathered all of the stories about her that I could find in an archive which is kept by The Sun, which is one of the UK's leading celebrity tabloid newspapers. And I just gathered all of the stories that I could find about her, so I could say with confidence, this is the way that The Sun has represented Charlotte Crosby. And I looked for stories which represented key CIP themes. So, how many stories were there about Charlotte Crosby paying a price for success? How many stories were making fun of her? How many stories were about her aging badly, for example? And then I compared these with more positive stories about, her being successful, friendship, being happy, all of those sorts of things. And then what that method allowed me to do was to say, well, what I would come out with is a fairly simple count of the numbers of stories which reflect the sorts of themes that TV audiences were encountering about women in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s versus other sorts of stories that are more positive. So my method is a way of testing if the sorts of ideas that cultural indicators found as being propagated by television in the broadcast era, are still around in the celebrity era. So again, I've explained my sample. Well, I've picked a leading source of celebrity gossip. I've explained how I'm going to analyze the stories. I'm looking for indicators of themes that people saw in other kinds of media content. And what I'm able to do is explain how the evidence that I'm looking for and the evidence that I'm reporting relates to an existing academic debate. And so what I'm going to do in the next video is just explain how that data analysis works in practice.